Maher isn't backing off AOC and Mamdani. If anything, he's sharpened the argument. New material, same underlying point. The language coming out of this wing of the party keeps giving away more than its own supporters seem to realize. Here's what's actually new and why it lands harder than the last round. Before we get into it, hit like and subscribe now. This channel breaks down exactly this kind of claim every week, and you don't want to miss the next one. Start with Mamdani, because this is the most direct piece of evidence yet, and it didn't come from a speech or an interview. It came from his own social media account. Maher pointed out that Mamdani tweeted a line lifted almost word for word from Karl Marx. "You work as much as you are able and no more than needed." That's not Maher's paraphrase of some vague progressive sentiment. That's Marx's own formula, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, reworded just enough to post without citing the source, but not enough to hide where it came from. Maher's response cut right to it. They're not trying to hide it. That detail matters more than it might seem at first. A politician using communist-adjacent policy ideas is one thing. You can debate rent control or public housing on the merits without invoking Marx at all. A sitting mayor of the largest city in America directly quoting Marx's own words on his own platform for his own followers to see is a different category of statement entirely. It's not a critic's interpretation or a hostile paraphrase. It's the mayor doing the branding himself. It's worth being precise about the actual line Mamdani used and why it maps so closely onto Marx's original formula. From each according to his ability to each according to his needs is arguably the single most famous sentence Marx ever wrote. It's the closing line of his critique of the Gotha program, and it's been used as shorthand for communist economic organization for over a century. Mamdani's version, "work as much as you're able, no more than needed," swaps the structure slightly but preserves the exact underlying logic. Contribution based on capacity, distribution based on need, rather than a market system tying reward to output. That's not a vague gesture toward fairness or economic justice in the abstract. It's the specific mechanism Marx proposed as the endpoint of a communist economy, restated closely enough that anyone who's read the original immediately recognizes it, and this is happening against the backdrop of a real measurable electoral trend, not an isolated incident. The DSA has recorded dozens of primary and general election victories this cycle alone, expanding well beyond its traditional strongholds into congressional primaries in New York and Colorado, along with municipal races in places that would have seemed inhospitable to openly socialist campaigns just a few years ago. Mamdani's own election gave the movement its most visible office holder yet and a national platform to recruit from. That's the actual structural reason Maher keeps returning to this topic. It's not a fringe curiosity anymore. It's a movement with real momentum and real wins, which makes the specific language its most visible leaders use considerably more consequential than it would have been a decade ago. Maher didn't stop with that one tweet either. He laid out the broader coalition Mamdani sits inside of, and it's worth walking through in full because the language keeps escalating rather than softening. He pointed to the Marxist Unity Group, a faction operating inside the DSA, whose own stated language describes their commitment as the long-term struggle for a fully liberated classless society. In a word, Maher noted, communism. Not Maher's word for it, their word for it. He also brought up Seaweaver, the tenant advocate Mamdani personally installed to run the city's housing office, who has publicly posted the words, "elect more communists," and got applause from her own side for it, not backlash. And he cited Daria-Liza Avila-Chevalier, a DSA-endorsed congressional candidate who's campaigned alongside Mamdani, who has openly called for seizing all property from landlords using nearly identical language to Mamdani's own. Put those pieces next to each other and the pattern is hard to argue with. This isn't one out-of-context phrase from one politician. It's a mayor quoting Marx directly, his own. Hand-picked housing director cheering for more communists, and a congressional candidate in his own coalition calling for outright property seizure, all within the same political network, all using the same vocabulary, none of it walked back or distanced from by the others. Maher's read on this was blunt. Maybe you missed that in school, or missed school altogether, but that's communism, and we've tried it, and it doesn't work. Now to AOC, and this material is different in tone, but points at the same underlying thing. After AOC's public breakup with her longtime fiancé went public, she described the split by saying they could still be comrades. Maher couldn't resist pointing out the obvious, using that specific word, unprompted, To describe an ex-partner isn't just an odd word choice. It's a small, almost involuntary tell about which political vocabulary someone reaches for by default when they're not being careful about optics. It's worth being fair here because a single word in a breakup announcement isn't the same magnitude of evidence as a mayor quoting Marx directly. People use loaded words casually all the time without meaning to signal anything ideological by it. But Maher's point wasn't that this one word proves AOC is a secret radical. It's that the word choice fits a pattern he's been tracking for years. Going back to a 2021 exchange where he directly challenged her dismissal of concerns about wokeness as something only older people worry about and pointed out that the term had been proudly embraced by progressives themselves right up until it became politically inconvenient. AOC's public vocabulary, across several years now, keeps landing on the same ideological register almost reflexively, even in moments, like a breakup announcement, that have nothing to do with policy at all. It's worth revisiting that older 2021 exchange in a bit more detail, because it shows this isn't a new line of criticism Maher invented for the current news cycle. It's a consistent thread running back years. Maher had cited veteran Democratic strategist James Carville's post-election diagnosis that the party's losses came down to what Carville bluntly called stupid wokeness. AOC's response was to dismiss the word itself as a relic mostly used by older people, implying the entire critique could be waved away as generational confusion rather than engaged with directly. Maher's pushback at the time was pointed. Democrats and progressive institutions had proudly embraced and popularized that exact word for years, right up until it became a political liability, at which point the strategy shifted to pretending the word had always been a bad-faith right-wing invention. That kind of rhetorical retreat, embracing a framework enthusiastically until it stops being convenient, then denying it was ever really yours, is its own separate pattern worth naming, and it's one Maher has kept returning to across nearly 5 years of commentary on her specifically, well before Mamdani or the DSA's recent surge ever entered the picture. That's really what connects these two pieces of new material, even though one is a mayor's serious policy tweet and the other is an offhand comment about an ex-fiancée. Maher's underlying argument isn't that either of them is secretly plotting a revolution. It's that the vocabulary of far-left ideology has become so normalized inside this specific political circle that it surfaces without any apparent self-awareness. In official policy statements, in casual social media posts, even in personal life updates that have nothing to do with governing. When the language shows up that consistently, in that many different contexts, calling it a pattern isn't an exaggeration. It's just an accurate description of what's actually on the record. It's worth giving the fair pushback here too, because it exists and it's not nothing. Defenders of both figures would argue that policing casual word choice, a joke about an ex being a comrade, a mayor quoting a philosopher whose ideas about labor and fairness have influenced plenty of mainstream economic thought beyond just communism specifically, risks turning every offhand comment into a loyalty test. Not every reference to shared struggle or collective labor is a coded communist manifesto. Context matters, and some of what Maher's flagging here is genuinely more ambiguous than the Mamdani housing office material. But the volume and consistency of the pattern is what makes the ambiguous cases harder to wave away entirely. If this were one tweet, one joke, one candidate's stray comment, the benign interpretation would be the more reasonable one. It's the accumulation, Marx quoted directly, a housing director cheering for more communists, a congressional candidate calling for property seizure, and now casual vocabulary showing up even outside of policy contexts. That shifts the burden. At a certain point, the more generous interpretation stops being the more plausible one, and Maher's basic argument is that this movement crossed that point a while ago, whether its own members have noticed it yet or not. It's also worth ending on the stakes Maher himself has attached to all of this, because he hasn't left it as a purely rhetorical observation. He's repeated across multiple segments now that his own vote is genuinely in play for the next presidential election if the party keeps trending in this direction, going so far as to say, in one of his sharper lines, that he'd vote for Sarah Palin before backing the version of the party this coalition represents. That's not a small thing for a lifelong Democrat and a decades-long critic of the Republican Party to say out loud, repeatedly, on his own platform. Whether you find that threat credible or performative, it's a genuine signal about where he thinks the persuadable center of the electorate actually sits. And his argument is that every one of these examples, the tweet, the housing director, the congressional candidate, the offhand comment about an ex-fiancée, is exactly the kind of accumulating evidence that pushes a voter like him further away rather than closer. It's also worth naming what makes this specific complaint land differently than a standard Republican attack on the same material, and it goes back to who's making it. Maher isn't a Fox News host reading DSA quotes to a conservative audience already primed to find them alarming. He's a lifelong Democrat, a self-described classical liberal who's spent decades mocking the Republican Party more consistently than almost anyone else with a national platform. When he reads these quotes to his own audience, an audience that skews liberal, an audience that's generally sympathetic to progressive politics, and that audience audibly gasps, that's a genuinely different signal than the same material landing on a conservative show. It suggests the gap between how this language is perceived inside the movement itself and how it lands with even a friendly, left-leaning general audience is wider than DSA's own leadership seems to appreciate. That gap is really the whole story here, more than any single tweet or joke. A movement can be completely sincere in its stated goals and still badly misjudge how those goals sound to people who aren't already inside the coalition. Mamdani quoting Marx to his own followers might read as authentic and unremarkable within that specific online space. The same quote, read out loud to a broader television audience that doesn't already share those assumptions, produces an audible gasp. Both reactions are real. The question this whole stretch of commentary keeps circling is which reaction the party should actually be paying attention to if it wants to build a majority coalition rather than just a passionately committed minority one. And Maher's answer, delivered again and again across this year's segments, is that the gasp in the room is the more important data point, not the applause line that got the tweet posted in the first place. It's worth digging a little further into why that gasp reaction is so telling, because audience reactions on a live taping aren't scripted or coached the way a lot of television moments are. Real-time studio audience skews politically engaged and generally sympathetic to the Democratic Party. This isn't a hostile crowd primed to boo anything left of center. When that specific audience audibly gasps at hearing DSA figures' own words read back to them verbatim without editorializing or added context, that's a meaningful signal about the actual gap between how this rhetoric is discussed inside its own online ecosystem versus how it lands with an otherwise sympathetic general audience encountering it for the first time, stripped of the framing that normally surrounds it in progressive media spaces. There's also a strategic angle here worth spelling out, because it connects directly to why Maher keeps returning to this topic rather than treating any single instance as a one-off. Political movements build coalitions by expanding outward from a committed base toward the much larger group of persuadable, less ideologically fixed voters who decide most competitive elections. The specific vocabulary a movement's leaders use in unguarded moments, a tweet, an offhand joke, a housing director's social media post, functions as a kind of unintentional focus group result. It shows what the movement's leadership actually believes when they're not carefully managing message discipline for a general audience. And what keeps showing up in those unguarded moments, according to everything Maher's laid out across this stretch of commentary, isn't a movement quietly discovering it needs to moderate its language to grow. It's the opposite, language that keeps escalating in specificity and confidence, as if the growing string of primary wins is being read as validation rather than as evidence the party's actual weak spot with general election voters hasn't been tested yet. That's ultimately the more useful way to think about all of this than treating any single quote as the smoking gun. No individual piece of evidence here, not the tweet, not the housing director's post, not the breakup comment, proves anything definitive on its own. What the accumulation actually demonstrates is a consistency of instinct across multiple figures, multiple contexts, and multiple moments that weren't coordinated with each other. That consistency is harder to write off as coincidence or selective editing than any single clip would be, and it's exactly the kind of pattern that a movement serious about expanding its coalition beyond its current base would want to take seriously, rather than dismissing every individual example as an isolated incident blown out of proportion by a critic who was already looking for one. This particular stretch of commentary is worth watching as it develops, not just as a snapshot of where things stand right now. If the pattern Maher's describing is real, it should keep showing up in new, unscripted moments over the coming months. More social media posts, more offhand comments, more candidates using the same escalating vocabulary as their primary wins pile up. If it's not real, or if it's genuinely overstated, the language from this wing of the party should start moderating as its most visible figures gain more national exposure and more scrutiny from audiences that aren't already inside the coalition. Either way, the next few months of primary season are going to be a pretty direct test of which red on this movement actually holds up. If you like this breakdown, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you catch the next one.